In the blistering summer of 1925, a lone stretch of Nevada desert earned a name whispered only in gas stations and saloons: the Crossroads. A place where travelers stopped for water, for rest, and were never seen again. Horses were found tied to posts with no riders. Cars' doors open, keys still in the ignition, baking under the sun. Locals swore they saw figures walking along the horizon, thin, shimmering shapes that vanished as soon as you blinked. And though the desert swallowed every clue, one thing was certain: once you crossed that dirt road, you didn't come back the same, if you came back at all. The Crossroads lay about 15 miles east of Tonopah, Nevada, where two dirt tracks met in a shallow basin surrounded by dry, shifting hills. In the early 1920s, this part of the desert was a restless place, half ghost town, half mirage. Tonopah had once thrived on silver, but by 1925 its mines were nearly exhausted. The people who stayed behind lived in scattered homesteads and small ranches, surviving off mail routes, cattle trade, and the occasional drifter passing through. To outsiders, this was nothing but empty space. But to those who called it home, the desert had moods, and the Crossroads was where those moods turned dark. Old-timers said the intersection had existed long before any wagon or automobile marked its dust. The paths, they claimed, were once ancient native trails that led from the mountains to natural springs, back when the land still held water. Over time, miners and settlers used the same routes, turning the faint paths into narrow roads. But one stretch never settled. It shifted like the ground couldn't decide where it belonged. Horses balked at it, compasses twitched. Even the air seemed heavier there, as though it carried the weight of something unseen. In early summer, travelers from the east would stop at the Crossroads to rest before the long push to Tonopah or Goldfield. There was a wooden post there once, half-buried, splintered, carved with initials from decades of passers-by. Beneath it sat a small crate where ranchers sometimes left messages or spare supplies for others. It was meant as a symbol of hospitality in a land that offered little mercy. But by 1925, that post had taken on a different kind of legend. People began whispering that if you waited there too long, the desert would notice you. Residents in Tonopah recalled stories told by travelers who'd stopped by their general store. Men who said they'd seen a pale light flicker near the Crossroads at dusk, or heard something moving in the dunes that wasn't wind or coyote. They'd laugh when they told it, brushing it off as nerves or heat exhaustion, but their eyes never quite matched the tone. The desert could play tricks on anyone, especially in the late afternoon when mirages shimmered across the horizon like ghostly lakes. Still, even those who knew the terrain avoided that spot after dark. Local folklore began to fuse with tragedy. Some said the Crossroads was cursed after a prospector killed another man there over a claim in 1908. Others believed the soil was tainted, some unnatural mineral or gas that confused the mind. But there were no scientific explanations then, and superstition filled the gaps. The people of Nye County lived between faith and fear, where the boundaries of the world were still uncertain. By 1925, newspapers described that region as a corridor of disappearances. A map published by the Tonopah Times Bonanza circled the area in red ink, warning motorists to avoid unnecessary travel beyond daylight hours. A small outpost built by a rancher named Reuben Doss stood about 2 miles away, and he often offered coffee or fuel to anyone who passed. Doss told a visiting journalist that he'd seen something like shadows walking against the wind one evening, though nothing around him moved. Even before the vanishings began, the Crossroads carried an air of isolation unlike anywhere else in Nevada. It was not simply distance that separated it from civilization. It was silence. No birds called. No insects hummed. When the wind rose, it did not whistle. It groaned like breath through hollow ground. For those who dared cross it, the world seemed to hold still. And once the first travelers disappeared that summer, the stories that once felt like folklore began to sound like warnings. The first disappearances began quietly, almost too ordinary to raise alarm. In June of 1925, a man named Henry Lovett, a 43-year-old mail carrier from Tonopah, was due to deliver letters and supplies to a remote ranch south of the Crossroads. He'd been doing the route for years, a reliable figure known for his discipline and calm. On June 14th, he loaded his mule, packed lightly, and left town just before dawn. By afternoon, the temperature had reached nearly 110 degrees. The desert shimmered so violently it was hard to tell where the sky ended and the earth began. When Lovett didn't arrive by nightfall, no one worried. He was known to camp if sandstorms hit. But the next morning his mule was found wandering near town, reins dragging, eyes wild. The saddlebag was still attached, the letters untouched. A search party followed Lovett's usual path, led by Sheriff Amos Dillard. They reached the crossroads around midday. There, near the old wooden post, they found Lovett's hat pressed into the sand, his footprints beside it. They led in a perfectly straight line toward a ridge of dunes, and then stopped as if he'd been lifted from the ground. There were no signs of struggle, no tracks leading back, and no drag marks that might suggest he'd been attacked, just an empty stretch of earth that offered no answers. Dillard later wrote in his report that the sand was oddly cool to the touch, as though something had recently moved beneath it. Within 2 weeks, another case surfaced. A traveling salesman named Walter Walt Marin vanished while driving from Goldfield to Tonopah. His Ford coupe was discovered 2 miles off the main road, parked neatly beside a mesquite bush. The keys were still in the ignition, and the engine had long cooled. Inside were 2 sample cases of silver trinkets and a half-eaten sandwich. Tire tracks led back toward the crossroads, but his footprints, again, ended abruptly a few yards into the desert. Sheriff Dillard's men found no evidence of foul play, no blood, no broken glass, no robbery. Marin's money was untouched. Locals began to avoid the area. Ranchers rerouted their herds. Truck drivers who hauled ore between mining towns started making detours of nearly 50 miles just to steer clear. But curiosity has its own pull, and not everyone believed the tales. A month later, the Hastings family, a husband, wife, and their 6-year-old son, decided to take the direct road through the crossroads to visit relatives in Tonopah. They never arrived. When the search team found their Model T 3 days later, the sight was unnerving. The vehicle sat squarely on the edge of the crossroads, the front wheels half buried in sand. The doors hung open. Inside lay a picnic basket, an open map, and a woman's straw hat. There were no signs of violence, no signs of distress, only the impression that the family had calmly stepped out. Clara Hastings' shoes were still on the back seat, along with her son's small wooden toy. Footprints, 3 sets, led away from the car and into the desert, each perfectly spaced as though the family had been walking deliberately toward something. Half a mile out, the track split. The man's set veered north, the smaller ones continued east, and then, as before, they ended. Newspapers across Nevada seized the story. The Reno Gazette ran the headline, 3 lost at the crossroads, no clues, no shadows. Some reporters speculated about bandits, others about quicksand or hallucinations brought on by the heat. But the desert that summer was dry as bone. No quicksand, no mirage could explain why strong, healthy people simply vanished in daylight. By mid-July, the region had earned its grim reputation. The last known disappearance that year came in late August. A pair of miners, traveling with supplies for a new dig site near the Hot Creek Range. They were seen passing through Belmont at dusk, and by morning their wagon was found at the crossroads. One mule still tethered, the other gone. The harness was torn as if something had startled it. Inside the wagon were their picks, canteens, and journals. The final entry in one of the men's notebooks read, "Voices at the edge of camp again. Thought it was the wind, but they keep calling my name." By the time autumn came, 8 people had disappeared within a 10-mile radius. The crossroads had transformed from a harmless landmark to a forbidden zone. Even seasoned lawmen stopped patrolling it. To some, it was fear. To others, respect. But for everyone who heard the stories, the message was the same. Something in that desert was watching, waiting, and taking. When investigators began to examine the places where travelers had vanished, what they found was not violence but silence. A kind of emptiness that seemed staged, deliberate, and impossible to explain. Each site bore the same marks: a vehicle or wagon abandoned in perfect condition, possessions untouched, food uneaten, and not a trace of where the people had gone. It was as if they had stepped out for a moment and been erased mid-motion. Sheriff Amos Dillard's reports from the summer of 1925 described unsettled sand patterns around the crossroads, shallow indentations that didn't match the normal shape of boots or wagon wheels. He wrote that the prints appeared rounded, almost melted, and that some were spaced too far apart to belong to a human stride. When his deputies measured the tracks left by the Hastings family, they noticed something stranger still. The impressions were crisp for the first 100 feet, then began to blur and thin out until they vanished completely. It wasn't that the wind had swept them away. The sand there was still and compact. The prints had simply faded mid-step. They followed that path with stakes and string, hoping to map where the footprints should have led, but they found nothing. No rocks, no crevices, no caves or wells. The desert was flat for miles, open and unforgiving. Around this time, a prospector named Eli Brogan claimed to have discovered a patch of scorched earth near the crossroads. He said the ground there felt brittle underfoot, like walking over old glass. When he drove a shovel into the spot, the sand beneath emitted a faint static crackle as though charged. Brogan, who had worked in mines his entire life, told the sheriff he'd never seen anything like it. He suspected a natural electrical discharge from quartz veins, but Dillard dismissed the theory. Whatever it was, it left no residue, no burn marks, no logical clue. Still, that patch of ground would later come up in more than one disappearance report, always within a mile radius of it. Then came the matter of the prints, those that didn't belong to anyone known. During one of the search efforts, Deputy George Callahan found what he described as split tracks in the sand. They began as regular boot impressions, but after several yards, each step divided into two smaller prints, as if the person's feet had split apart. The second set of prints ran parallel to the first for a few feet, and then veered off sharply toward the dunes, where they too vanished. The deputy's sketch of the scene, later discovered in the county archive, shows a pattern impossible to reproduce by man or animal. At night, search teams reported other anomalies. Flashlights flickered without cause. Compasses spun erratically. The air itself felt heavy, as if charged with static before a lightning storm. One miner, part of the volunteer group, described hearing metal scraping on stone even though there were no rocks in sight. Another said the sound of footsteps echoed behind them, perfectly timed to their own, yet always one beat late. The sheriff dismissed these claims as nerves, but privately, his notes reveal something more troubling. He too had seen the lights. On July 20th, during a night sweep, Dillard and his men saw 3 distant glows moving across the flat plain beyond the crossroads. They floated low like lanterns, drifting in an unbroken line. The men rode toward them, calling out, but the lights never grew closer. They only moved further away until they dissolved into the heat shimmer. When the team reached the spot, they found the same circular arrangement of footprints that would later define the case. Tracks looping endlessly around a single point, circling something invisible. No matter how carefully they documented the evidence, it refused to stay still. Footprints shifted overnight. Tools misplaced themselves. A shovel left upright would be found lying flat the next morning, half buried in sand. It was as if the desert itself was wiping its surface clean after every intrusion, refusing to let anyone uncover what it hid. The men who participated in those searches began to have vivid dreams, visions of being watched, of whispers in the dunes. Some refused to return. By the end of the summer, investigators had collected a series of conflicting details that only deepened the confusion. The vehicles and belongings proved the disappearances were real. The footprints confirmed people had walked willingly into the desert. But the way those tracks ended, the unnatural heat beneath certain patches of earth and the rhythmic appearance of those ghostly lights all pointed toward something beyond comprehension. The crossroads had ceased to be a simple location. It had become a boundary, a place where evidence existed but reason did not. In late July of 1925, a miner named Thomas Greeley arrived in Tonopah with a story that set the entire town on edge. He claimed his closest friend, a fellow prospector named Martin Cobb, had vanished near the crossroads 2 weeks earlier. The two had been scouting for signs of silver deposits along an old wash. One evening, Cobb wandered off to gather firewood and never came back. Greeley searched through the night, calling his name until his throat gave out. In the morning, he found Cobb's footprints leading east, straight toward the open desert. They stopped, as all the others had, in the middle of nowhere. What disturbed Greeley most wasn't the disappearance itself, but the fact that his own footprints from the night before were missing too. The ground was smooth, untouched, as though the desert had swallowed both men's tracks while he slept. His story drew skepticism at first. The sheriff's men had grown weary of new tales, but Greeley was different. He was steady, sober, a man who'd spent decades underground reading the texture of rock and sand. He spoke with a kind of restraint that made him believable. "It's not the heat and it's not outlaws," he told the men at the saloon. "It's the land itself. It's moving when no one's looking." Within days, he made the decision to go back alone. He wanted to find proof, or at least his friend's remains. Locals warned him not to, and Sheriff Dillard refused to sanction another official search. So Greeley packed his mule, a tent, a lantern, and a leather-bound journal. He reached the crossroads by nightfall on July 27th and made camp beside the old post. The first pages of his recovered journal, later found buried near his abandoned tent, give a haunting glimpse into what happened next. Night 1, he wrote. Wind steady. Clear skies. I keep hearing something soft like boots dragging through sand, but there's no one out here. The air feels thick, like it's full of dust I can't see. He described how his lantern flickered without reason, and how he thought he saw shapes shifting on the horizon. Not shadows, he wrote, more like ripples in the air. On the second night, his tone changed. He noted that the temperature dropped sharply after sunset, and that the silence became so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. Then came the lights. 3 of them, he wrote, moving together about a man's height off the ground. They flowed in a line, same distance apart. Bright as lanterns, but steady. I thought maybe another camp, but there's no fire smoke. No sound. He approached within 50 yards before the lights drifted apart, spreading across the plain, then vanishing all at once. When he returned to his tent, his footprints from earlier had disappeared. By the third entry, Greeley's writing had grown hurried, uneven. He mentioned finding new prints beside his camp that weren't there the night before, barefoot, small, circling the tent. He wrote of whispers rising with the wind, a woman's voice calling faintly from somewhere in the dunes, repeating his name. The last words in the journal read, "They're standing closer now. I see their faces, or what's left of them, hollow eyes full of dust. They don't blink. The sand moves under them like it's breathing. If this is where the lost go, I think I understand why they never return." When Sheriff Dillard led a small group out to the site 2 weeks later, they found Greeley's camp still intact. His mule was gone, but his lantern and shovel remained. The journal was discovered half buried under a thin layer of sand, its pages dry, the ink barely faded. Around the tent were dozens of prints, some belonging to boots, others unidentifiable. They formed a wide circle, as though something had surrounded him before disappearing into the desert. Dillard's men followed the clearest set of tracks until they simply ended mid-stride. The sheriff, who'd grown hardened to the strangeness of the case, refused to speak publicly about what else they saw there. In private notes later found among his papers, he wrote, "We found a shallow impression in the sand, like someone lying face down. But when we brushed it away, there was nothing underneath. Only cold earth." The journal became the only surviving record of what might. When the disappearances became impossible to ignore, Sheriff Amos Dillard organized the most extensive search operation Nye County had ever seen. He was a methodical man, not one to indulge superstition, and his reputation depended on keeping the panic from spreading. By early August 1925, he had 20 men under his command, deputies, ranchers, a few ex-miners, and a tracker from the Paiute tribe named Redbird, whose family had lived near the region for generations. They rode out from Tonopah before dawn, each man carrying water, provisions, and a piece of cloth to tie over his mouth against the dust. The sheriff's plan was simple: sweep every mile of the crossroads and surrounding desert until they found some trace of the missing. At first, the search followed standard procedure. The men divided into groups of 4, marking their routes with wooden stakes wrapped in white cloth. By the second day, the heat was relentless and several horses had to be turned back. Dillard remained at the center of the formation, his eyes scanning the horizon for movement. At noon, one of his men found something half buried near the dunes, a child's shoe. It matched the size described in the Hastings case. Around it, faint footprints curved in a strange looping pattern, almost like someone had been walking in circles. They followed them for a few yards before they disappeared into open sand. That night, they set up camp near the ridge where Henry Lovett's trail had ended. The wind rose steadily until it roared through the tents like a living thing, scattering ash from their fires. Several men swore they heard voices in the gusts, whispers, too distinct to be wind, but Dillard dismissed it as fatigue. Still, in his own notes, he admitted to unease. "Sound travels wrong here," he wrote. "It comes from nowhere, then all at once from every direction." The next morning, Redbird approached the sheriff quietly. He pointed toward the distant dunes and said something in his native tongue that Dillard didn't fully understand. When pressed, the tracker explained that the ground there was thin. The sheriff laughed it off, assuming he meant soft sand, but Redbird shook his head. "Not soft," he said. "Hollow." They rode to the spot he indicated, where the sand had hardened into a pale crust. When Dillard prodded it with his boot, he felt a vibration, faint but rhythmic, pulsing beneath the surface like a heartbeat. They dug for several minutes, but the harder they dug, the colder the sand became. Finally, one of the men shouted, saying he could hear something, like a low hum rising from below. Dillard ordered them to stop and move on, but that sound followed them for the rest of the day, an almost inaudible thrum carried on the wind. By the third day, morale was faltering. 2 men refused to continue after finding their own tracks altered overnight. Where they had walked the day before, the prints now formed a circle, looping back toward the center of camp. They packed their things and rode back to Tonopah, muttering about curses and restless spirits. The remaining group pushed on toward the basin, where the first disappearances had occurred. There they discovered something that would haunt every man present. At the crossroads itself, the ground was covered with shallow depressions, hundreds of them, like footprints, but lighter, shallower, as if pressed by something barely touching the earth. They stretched out in every direction, forming patterns that made no sense, spirals, broken lines, and clusters that seemed deliberate. Redbird refused to step into them. "They're not tracks," he said. "They're memories." Dillard, unnerved but determined, ordered his men to mark the area and take measurements. That night, none of them slept. On the morning of the 4th day, when they prepared to return to town, the sheriff counted only 19 men. One was missing, a deputy named Howard Mills, last seen keeping watch near the old wooden post. His rifle lay on the ground, unfired. His canteen was full. His prints led away from the post toward the dunes in a straight line until they stopped. Dillard said nothing on the ride back, but those who knew him said he was never the same after that. He resigned from office the following year and refused to discuss the crossroads again. His final report concluded simply, "Search conducted thoroughly. No evidence of life, no evidence of death. The desert gives back nothing." In the months that followed the failed investigation, the empty stretch of land between Tonopah and Belmont became the center of wild speculation. People needed answers, and since lawmen had none, theories began to multiply like mirages. Some were practical, others impossible, but all carried the same uneasy tone. Something unnatural was happening at the crossroads. The first and most common explanation was that outlaws were using the desert as a trap. Nevada's mining towns had long been magnets for desperate men. Bandits, bootleggers, and drifters who vanished into the sand when the law got too close. Locals claimed the disappearances were the work of an ambush crew who robbed travelers, buried their bodies, and left their belongings to confuse investigators. But when deputies returned to the sites, they found valuables untouched. Gold watches, cash, tools, even food supplies. Whatever was taking these people, it wasn't theft. Another theory blamed the land itself. Geologists speculated that hidden sinkholes or pockets of soft sediment could swallow a man whole without leaving much evidence, but Tonopah's miners rejected the idea. There were no caverns or mine shafts near the crossroads deep enough to cause that. The ground there was compact, solid, unyielding. Others believed in a stranger form of natural danger. A prospector, who passed through, claimed that strange flashes of light appeared before nightfall, and that static electricity made his hair stand on end. He thought the desert might be a site of magnetic interference, something powerful enough to disorient travelers and erase tracks. Scientists from Reno briefly entertained the idea of a rare mineral deposit, or even a lightning phenomenon, but they never visited the site themselves. Then came the whispers of something older, something spiritual. The Paiute people had always spoken cautiously of that land. According to oral tradition, the area around the crossroads was once a boundary between worlds. a place where spirits wandered between realms of the living and the dead. The old trails that intersected there were not meant for settlers. They were ceremonial paths used for mourning rituals, routes meant to lead souls toward rest. Redbird, the same tracker who had helped Sheriff Dillard, later told a newspaper that the white men had broken the circle when they carved their roads across it. He believed the disappearances were not crimes but reclamations. "The desert remembers what belongs to it," he said. His statement was dismissed as folklore, but many locals who had lost family in the vanishings found comfort in the explanation. Still, other ideas bordered on the supernatural. Some claimed the crossroads was a kind of mirage trap, a phenomenon where heat distortion created pockets of altered space. Travelers would follow a false horizon and unknowingly walk into nothingness. Others swore it was a time slip, a fracture in reality where moments folded over themselves. Truck drivers passing through decades later told stories of seeing strange lights that moved against the wind, sometimes forming the outline of wagons or figures walking in pairs. A few even said they'd seen people standing in the road dressed in early 20th century clothing, waving for help before fading away into the sand. By the late 1930s, the legend of the crossroads had hardened into one of Nevada's great mysteries. The state highway bypassed the area entirely, and maps quietly stopped labeling the intersection. Travelers who ventured too close often reported car troubles, engines stalling, headlights dimming, compasses spinning. Paranormal researchers visited in the 1950s and recorded unexplained static on audio devices, describing it as faint voices beneath a blanket of wind. One investigator noted a repeating pattern. Every missing traveler had been alone for at least part of their journey, as if solitude itself was the trigger. For decades, these theories remained unproven, blending science with myth until no one could tell where one ended, and even decades after the events of 1925, the crossroads retained its hold over those who traveled through that stretch of Nevada desert. Modern reports trickled in slowly at first, often from truckers or campers who dared take the old dirt trails in place of the newer highways. They spoke of the same eerie phenomena, lights that hovered in the distance, figures walking along the horizon that disappeared if approached, and the unsettling sensation that the desert itself was alive, watching their every move. Some would stop to investigate and find nothing but windswept sand and the faint impression of footprints that made no sense. One particularly chilling account came from a pair of geologists in the 1970s. They were surveying mineral deposits near Tonopah when their vehicle began to stall repeatedly near the crossroads. One of the men swore that shadows passed just beyond the headlights, too tall and thin to be human. When he stepped out, the ground appeared unusually soft in patches, though the surrounding desert was hard-packed. They tried to follow the impressions only to find them fading abruptly, as if swallowed by the earth. Frustrated and unnerved, they left the area, returning to Tonopah shaken and silent for days. Motorcyclists and long-haul drivers continued to report similar occurrences well into the 1990s and 2000s. Many spoke of the same three lanterns floating in formation along the horizon, a direct echo of what Thomas Greeley had recorded in 1925. Those who stopped to observe often noticed that the lights didn't cast shadows on the ground, and their reflections seemed to shimmer in the desert heat rather than glow steadily. Some claimed that the figures of people appeared briefly in the beams of headlights before vanishing entirely, leaving the road perfectly empty once again. Local historians began compiling testimonies, noticing a pattern. Most of the sightings involved solitary travelers, especially those passing through after dusk or in the early morning. Couples or small groups tended to experience only subtle anomalies, whispers on the wind, fleeting shadows at the edge of vision, but the same reports of disappearing lights and footprints persisted among individuals traveling alone. Researchers speculated that isolation heightened perception, that the desert's harshness distorted the senses. But skeptics and believers alike agreed that the crossroads had a reputation that extended far beyond folklore. Even GPS and modern mapping systems could not fully capture the area. Some digital surveys showed faint depressions that appeared and disappeared seasonally, giving rise to speculation that the desert itself shifted. Backpackers reported soft spots in otherwise solid terrain, almost like walking over invisible hollows. A few described a sudden drop in temperature near these patches, a chilling draft that carried with it faint murmurs, though there was no visible source. Psychologists studying these accounts suggested that the human mind might interpret subtle environmental cues in extreme isolation as figures or voices. Yet the consistency across generations of reports baffled even the most rigorous analysts. Several paranormal investigators visited the crossroads in the early 21st century. They recorded unexplained electromagnetic readings and faint audio anomalies, what they called desert echoes, that mimicked the sound of footsteps or murmured names. One team documented fleeting images on infrared cameras, thin, upright forms moving with an unnatural grace, appearing briefly then dissolving into the heat waves above the sand. They could not explain these phenomena, leaving the crossroads' reputation intact as a place of unresolved mystery. In addition to visual and auditory anomalies, some travelers reported changes in time perception. Watches and car clocks often stopped functioning correctly near the crossroads. Drivers recounted that a trip that should have taken an hour stretched into several, despite no detours. One young backpacker hiking alone at dusk claimed he had passed through the intersection multiple times without realizing it, the same dirt tracks looping endlessly as if the desert had created a circuit of its own. The stories persisted in local newspapers, blogs, and desert forums drawing curious explorers and thrill seekers. While few ventured far off the paved roads, those who did often returned with minor injuries or an overwhelming sense of being watched, though never with any clear explanation. The legend of the crossroads evolved, merging historical disappearances with contemporary experiences. Today, anyone who drives past Tonopah and follows the old trails knows the warnings. Stop too long, venture alone, or look too closely at the dunes, and you may find that the crossroads notices you, just as it did nearly a century ago.